I thought I was signing the deed to my freedom. I had no idea my mother had already promised that house to my brother, 6 months before I ever made an offer. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't knock on the door in the middle of the night, coat dripping with rain, hands bloody with what it's done. It sits at the kitchen table with you. It passes you the butter. It asks how your day was. And all the while, behind those familiar eyes, it's already counted every dollar you've saved, measured every room you thought was yours, and drawn up the terms of your destruction in neat, careful handwriting. My name is Clara. I was 31 years old when I bought that house, and I want to tell you exactly how it felt to hold those keys in my hand. Cold brass, slightly heavy, the kind of weight that makes your chest open up like a window on the first warm day of spring. I want to tell you that because I need you to understand what it meant before I tell you what happened next. I grew up watching my parents fight about money, not in the dramatic plate-smashing way you see in movies. Quietly, in the kitchen after dinner, voices drop to that particular register that children learn to hear through walls. My father worked in construction. My mother kept the books for a small insurance office 2 towns over. We were not poor, exactly, but we were close enough to poor that I learned early what it meant to go without something you needed. I learned to be careful. I learned to save. My brother Danny was 4 years younger than me, and from the beginning, the world treated us differently. He was funny, easy, the kind of boy who could walk into a room full of strangers and walk out with 6 new friends. I was quieter, more serious. I did my homework. I got scholarships. I left for college on a Tuesday morning with 2 suitcases and a clarity of purpose that felt at the time like armor. I studied accounting. I worked part-time through all 4 years. I graduated with almost no debt and took a job at a mid-sized firm in the city. And I spent the next 8 years doing what I had always done, being careful. I cooked at home. I bought clothes on sale. I drove a car with 200,000 miles on it, and I did not complain about this. Not once, because every month I watched my savings account grow by a number that felt, to me, like progress. I tracked my budget in a spreadsheet I updated every Sunday evening, a habit so ingrained it had become almost meditative. The quiet ritual of a woman who had learned very young that the only safety in the world was the safety you built yourself, brick by careful brick. My parents' house, the house where Danny and I grew up, was a 3-bedroom colonial on the edge of a small town called Millhaven, about 40 minutes from the city. It had a big kitchen, a porch that wrapped around the front and part of the side, and a backyard that backed up to a strip of old-growth pine trees. The floors were original hardwood, dark and warm, scuffed in the places where decades of living had left their marks. A long, pale scratch near the kitchen door, where my father had dragged in a heavy cooler every summer. A slight dip near the bottom of the stairs, where the wood had settled around 30 years of footsteps. My mother had planted roses along the south wall of the house every year since before I was born. The rose hedge was dense and sprawling and slightly wild, and in June it smelled like something out of a fairy tale. Thick and sweet and faintly spiced, the smell of every summer I had ever known. I loved that house. I don't think I ever stopped to examine how much until the possibility of buying it became real. It became real in March of last year, when my father called me on a Sunday evening and told me, gently but directly, that he and my mother had decided to sell. He was 67. My mother was 64. They were moving to a smaller place, a condo community about an hour south, near the coast. "We can't keep up with the yard anymore," he said. I could hear the particular quality of exhaustion in his voice, not just physical, but something deeper. The exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a house in his mind for 35 years and is finally ready to set it down. I asked him what they were listing it for. He told me. The number was lower than I expected, significantly lower, because he and my mother wanted it to go to family if possible, and because the kitchen needed updating and the roof had been patched twice in the last decade and would need replacing within a few years. I did the math in my head, standing in my apartment kitchen with my phone pressed to my ear, looking out the window at the city street below. I had enough. Not easily, not with much left over, but I had enough. I had scraped and planned and gone without for 8 years, and I had enough. "I'd like to buy it, Dad," I said. There was a pause, a short one, barely 2 seconds, but I felt it. At the time, I filed it away as simple surprise. "Let me talk to your mother," he said. "We'll figure out the details." The next 4 weeks were, in retrospect, the last genuinely peaceful weeks I would have for a very long time. I spoke to my mother twice on the phone. Warm, practical conversations about inspection timelines and whether the old dining room furniture might stay. She seemed happy. She laughed about the rose hedge, said I'd probably end up cursing it by July. I laughed too. I drove out to Millhaven on a Saturday and walked through every room, running my fingers along door frames and windowsills, already imagining which of my things would go where. I sat on the front porch for almost an hour in the late afternoon light and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Something like roots. Something like the specific peace of arriving somewhere you have always, on some level, been trying to get back to. My brother Danny called me the Friday before closing. We weren't estranged exactly, but we weren't close in the way some siblings are. There were long stretches where we might go 6 or 8 weeks without speaking, not out of hostility, but out of the particular distance that grows between adults who have built separate lives. He sounded strange on the phone, too casual, the way someone sounds when they're performing casualness over the top of something else entirely, layering lightness over a harder thing below. "So you're really going through with it," he said. "The house?" "Yes. Closing's next Thursday." "That's great," he said. "That's really great, Clara." And then, after a pause, I didn't know you had that kind of money saved up." I remember the small, cool touch of discomfort at that. The question felt slightly too personal, slightly too pointed, like a finger pressed against a bruise you hadn't known was there. But Danny had always been somewhat careless with boundaries, and I told myself I was reading into nothing. "Years of being boring," I said, and he laughed, and the conversation moved on. But something about the call stayed with me. A faint, low-grade unease I couldn't quite name, sitting at the back of my mind like a sound just below the threshold of hearing. The closing happened on a Thursday in April. I wore a gray blazer I'd bought specifically for the occasion, paired with dark trousers and the small gold earrings my father had given me when I graduated college. The lawyer's office smelled of old paper and fresh coffee, and the light through the tall windows was the pale gold of early spring. My parents were there. My father shook my hand when it was over, formally, the way men of his generation do when something important has been transferred from one person to another, and words are not quite adequate to the weight of it. My mother hugged me, and then held my face between both of her palms and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Pride, I thought. Love. Maybe something else. Something slightly shadowed, which I wasn't prepared to see and so didn't. I drove to Millhaven that evening with the keys in my pocket. I unlocked the front door and stood in the hallway of my childhood home, which was now my home, and I breathed in the smell of it. Pine floors, old wood, the faint ghost of my mother's lavender linen spray. And I let myself feel it, all of it. The years of saving and the years of going without, and the long, quiet discipline of a life built towards something real. I sat on the kitchen floor and ate a sandwich I'd brought in a paper bag, my back against the cabinet under the sink, and I thought, I did it. I actually did it. That was Thursday. By the following Monday, my brother had called my parents and told them I'd cheated him out of his inheritance. By Wednesday, my mother had stopped returning my calls. I didn't understand what was happening at first. My mother's silence felt like a misunderstanding, something that would resolve itself with a phone call, an explanation, a cup of tea, and a conversation at the kitchen table. I left 2 voicemails, friendly and light, asking her to call me back when she had a chance. I texted her a photo of the new curtains I'd hung in the kitchen, the blue linen ones I knew she'd like. No response. The texts sat there with their small delivered check marks, and the silence on the other end of them felt increasingly loud. On Thursday, exactly 1 week after closing, I called my father. He answered, but his voice was careful in a way that made my stomach tighten almost immediately. "Your brother is upset," he said. "About the house?" "He says he wanted it." I sat down. I was at my desk at work, and I stood up again and walked to the hallway, lowering my voice. "Dad, he never said anything to me. You listed it. You offered it to family first. I bought it at the price you gave me, with my own money. Every cent of it." "I know," my father said. And then, after a pause that lasted a beat too long, "But your mother feels like we should have had a conversation, all of you together, before anything was decided. A conversation about what? Whether I was allowed to buy my own childhood home?" He didn't answer directly. He said we should have dinner soon, all of us, and sort things out. He sounded tired in a way that went beyond fatigue, the sound of a man caught between 2 gravitational fields, pulled equally in opposite directions, slowly being torn apart by the competing force of them. I knew my father. I knew that voice. It was the voice he used when he had already been told what to think and hadn't yet decided whether to believe it. After I hung up, I sat in the hallway of my office building for a full minute, staring at the wall. The fluorescent light above me buzzed faintly and steadily, like something alive and slightly unwell. Someone walked past and said, "Good morning," and I nodded without speaking. I turned my phone over in my hands and looked at the dark screen and thought, very clearly and very quietly, something is wrong here. Something was wrong before it started, and I am only now beginning to feel the shape of it. The family dinner was set for the following Saturday. My mother chose the restaurant, an Italian place in town that we'd been going to for birthdays and anniversaries since I was a teenager. Red check tablecloths, candles in wine bottles, the kind of place that feels designed to make conflict impossible, as if the cheerful surroundings could absorb whatever tension you brought through the door and neutralize it before anyone said something they couldn't take back. I arrived first, at 7 on the dot, and sat at the table my mother had reserved in the back corner. I ordered a glass of water. I straightened my napkin. I told myself this was going to be fine. Danny arrived next without his wife. They'd been having problems, I'd heard, though he'd said nothing directly to me about it. He kissed me on the cheek in that slightly performative way he had, the gesture of a man who is demonstrating affection rather than feeling it. He sat across from me and ordered a beer and talked about work for 5 minutes without once meeting my eyes, and I watched him and thought, he knows exactly what tonight is about. He has been waiting for it. My parents arrived together, my father holding the door for my mother the way he always had, one hand light at the small of her back. My mother was wearing her good coat, the charcoal wool one she saved for occasions she considered important. She kissed me on the cheek, too, quickly, and sat down and unfolded her napkin with a precision that told me everything. This was not a dinner. This was a proceeding. We ordered. We made small talk about the weather, about the drive, about the new condo. My mother was having trouble with the HOA already, something about parking assignments. I watched Danny nod and laugh in all the right places, and I felt the specific nausea of a person who can see a storm coming but cannot yet name the direction it's moving from. It was my mother who brought it up after the bread arrived. She set down her knife, straightened her back slightly, and said, "Clara, we need to talk about the house." "All right," I said. I kept my voice even. I had decided in the car on the way over that I was going to be calm and reasonable, and I was going to stay that way regardless of what happened. "Your father and I have been talking," she said, "and we both feel, that we didn't handle the sale the way we should have. We should have spoken to both of you before we decided anything." "I understand that," I said, "but I want to be clear. Dad called me. He told me the house was for sale. I asked if I could buy it, and he said yes. That's the whole story." Danny made a sound. Not a word, just a short exhale through his nose. The sound of a man registering objection without committing to it openly. "Danny also had an interest in the house," my mother said. "He'd talked to us about it. We didn't pass that along to you, and that was our mistake." I looked at Danny. "You told them you wanted to buy it?" "I told them I'd been thinking about it," he said, "that I might want to make an offer, that I just needed a bit more time." "How much more time?" I said. "Dad called me in March. Closing was April. That's 4 weeks. How much time did you need?" "Clara," my father said quietly. "No," I said, still calm, still level. "I'm asking a genuine question. He says he was interested. He had 4 weeks. Why didn't he call me? Why didn't he make an offer?" Danny leaned forward. "Because I didn't know you were going to swoop in and lock the whole thing down in a month. I thought we had more time. I thought it was a family conversation, not a race." "It was a legal transaction," I said. "I paid full asking price, in cash, my own money. Money that Dad basically gifted you by pricing it below market," Danny said, and his voice had an edge to it now, the edge of someone who has rehearsed this particular line and is finally getting to use it. I felt the color rise in my face. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs under the table. The price they gave me reflected the condition of the house, the roof, the kitchen. Any buyer would have negotiated those same points. "But you weren't any buyer," my mother said gently. "You were family. And we thought, your father and I both thought, that you understood it would be a family decision, that you'd wait, talk to your brother." I looked at her. I looked at her for a long moment, at the expression on her face, reasonable, sorrowful, slightly injured, perfectly arranged, and something shifted in me, very slightly, like a floorboard settling. Because I knew my mother. I had known her for 31 years, and the woman sitting across from me, with her charcoal coat and her carefully set expression, was not the woman who had held my face in her hands at the lawyer's office and looked at me with something I'd thought was pride. This was a woman who had already decided something. This was a woman who had already made a plan. "What is it that you actually want?" I said. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. My mother looked at Danny. Danny looked at his beer. My father looked at the tablecloth. "We want you to consider selling the house to Danny," my mother said. "At the same price you paid. You'd get your full investment back. He could give you a few months to find something else." The restaurant noise continued around us. The clink of glasses, a burst of laughter from a table near the window, the faint sound of accordion music from the speakers overhead. The world went on making its ordinary sounds while something inside me went absolutely perfectly still. "You want me to sell my house," I said. "It was our house first," Danny said. "I grew up there too." "So did I said, "and I bought it." The dinner ended badly. There's no other way to describe it. By the time the entrees arrived, nobody was eating. My mother was pressing her lips together in that way she had that meant she was choosing not to say something she very much wanted to say. And Danny had pushed back from the table slightly and was staring at the wall with the expression of a man who believes he has been wronged so fundamentally that argument has become beneath him. My father kept his eyes down and said almost nothing. I paid for my own meal, which was an act so small it felt enormous. And I drove home in the dark with both hands on the wheel, and I thought about what my mother had said. "We want you to consider selling the house to Danny." She had not said, "if you'd like to," or "if you're willing to." She had said, "We want you to consider," as if the outcome were already known and this was merely the courtesy of informing me. I did not sleep much that night. I lay in my new bedroom, my childhood bedroom, the one with the east-facing window that filled with pale gold light at 6 a.m, and I stared at the ceiling and tried to arrange what I knew into a shape that made sense. But it kept sliding out of my hands, the way wet paper does, losing its form the moment I thought I had a grip on it. My mother had seemed surprised when my father told me the house was for sale, or had she? I ran the conversation back in my mind. The Sunday evening call. I had assumed it was a joint decision. Had my father told me it was? Or had I simply assumed because the decision was being delivered by my father that it was his decision too? I didn't know. And the not knowing was the worst part. 2 weeks passed. My mother called once, briefly, to tell me she and my father were settling in well at the condo, and the conversation was polite and surface level and lasted 6 minutes. Danny sent me a text saying he hoped I'd thought about the situation and that he was willing to be reasonable. I read it 3 times and did not reply. I had a locksmith come and change the locks, not because I thought anyone had a key, but because I needed to do something physical, something concrete, and the sound of the new deadbolt clicking into place was one of the most satisfying sounds I had heard in recent memory. Then, on a Friday afternoon in late May, my friend Jess called me at work. Jess had grown up in Millhaven. Her family still lived there. She worked from home now, and she walked her dog every morning on the same 3-block route, past the library, past the old hardware store, past the office of a local real estate agent named Diane Kowalski. She had walked past it that morning, as she did every morning, and she had noticed something in the window. A listing card, a photograph. It was my house. "Clara," she said, and her voice was careful in the way that Jess's voice was never careful, because Jess was the least careful person I had ever known. "I need you to look at something." She sent me the photo. I opened it at my desk. The listing was for a 3-bedroom colonial in Millhaven, described as a charming, original detail property with mature landscaping and a wraparound porch. The asking price was $60,000 more than what I had paid. I stared at the photo for a long time. It was taken from the street at the slight angle that made the porch look its widest, with the rose hedge blooming along the south wall in the early May light. My house was listed for sale. I owned it. My name was on the deed. I had the title insurance paperwork in the filing cabinet under my desk at that very moment. My hands, I noticed, were perfectly steady on the keyboard. I remember being surprised by that. I had expected to shake, to feel the blood drain from my face, to have some physical response proportional to the size of what I was looking at. Instead, I felt nothing. Or rather, I felt something so large and so cold that it registered as nothing at all, the way a temperature low enough stops feeling like cold and starts feeling like the absence of everything. I called Jess back. "How long has that listing been up?" She said she'd check. "Hold on." A pause. Keyboard sounds. Diane says it was submitted to MLS on Monday. Monday. That was 4 days ago. My house had been listed for sale for 4 days by someone who was not me, and I had not known about it. "Who's the seller listed as?" I said. Another pause. "It says..." Jess hesitated. "It says the property is being listed on behalf of the estate of Robert and Margaret Holt, as represented by their son Daniel Holt." My parents' names. My brother's name. An estate that did not exist, representing a sale that was not theirs to make. "Jess," I said very quietly, "I need you to go into that office and ask Diane for a copy of whatever documents Danny gave her to authorize that listing." "Clara, what's happening?" "I'll explain later. Can you go now?" There was a 20-minute gap. I sat at my desk and did not move and did not speak to anyone and did not look at anything except the photo of my house on my computer screen. A colleague stopped by and asked if I wanted anything from the coffee cart in the lobby, and I looked up at her face and felt briefly as though I were seeing her from very far away. I said, "No, thank you." She left. The phone on my desk made its small ticking sound as the minute changed. Jess called back. Her voice was different now, not careful anymore, but tight, the way a wire sounds when it's been stretched past the point it was designed for. "She gave me what she had," Jess said. "She thinks the listing is legitimate. She has a signed seller's disclosure form and a document she says is a notarized letter authorizing Danny to act on behalf of your parents in the sale of the property." "The property is not my parents' property," I said. "It is my property. My name is on the title." "I know," Jess said. I told her that. She went very quiet. She said she had no idea. "I need a copy of everything she was given," I said. "I need the name on the notarization, and I need the date." The documents arrived in my email 20 minutes later, forwarded by a clearly shaken Diane Kowalski, along with a short note saying she was pulling the listing immediately and was very sorry. I opened the authorization letter first. It was on plain white paper, formatted like a legal document, and it purported to be a notarized statement signed by both my parents authorizing Daniel Holt to act as their representative in the sale of the family property. The notary stamp was from a firm I didn't recognize. The date on the document was 2 weeks after my closing date, 2 weeks after I had legally purchased the house, 2 weeks after it had become, beyond any possible doubt, mine. I sat very still. The office hummed around me, the hum of computers, of the ventilation system, of 30 people going about their Thursday afternoon as if the floor were still solid beneath their feet. My floor was not solid. My floor had dropped away, and I was standing in air, and the document on my screen was a forgery, and my own family had tried to sell my house out from under me. The date on the authorization letter was May 12th. My closing was April 10th. This document had been created more than a month after the house became mine, designed to look as though it predated the sale, designed to look as though my parents had always intended for Danny to handle the property. And someone had taken it to a notary, someone had paid for that stamp, someone had walked into Diane Kowalski's office on a Monday morning with a folder and a confident expression and a plan that had been, I now understood, in motion for a very long time. I called an attorney that same afternoon. Her name was Patricia Voss, and she had been recommended to me by a colleague whose divorce had been, in his words, surgically precise. She was in her mid-50s with close-cropped silver hair and a manner of speaking that reminded me of a scalpel. Clean, economical, leaving no excess. I sat in her office at 5:30 with my folder of documents on the desk between us, and I told her everything, from the beginning, in order, as calmly as I could manage. She listened without interrupting, which I found both professional and deeply steadying. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She looked at the authorization letter, and then at my title deed, and then back at the letter. Your brother submitted a forged notarized document to a real estate agency in an attempt to list a property he does not own, she said. Do you have any reason to believe your parents signed this letter willingly? I thought about my father's voice on the phone. I thought about the expression on my mother's face at the Italian restaurant, the charcoal coat, the arranged expression, and I thought, suddenly and with a clarity that felt like cold water, about the 2-second pause when I'd told my father I wanted to buy the house. Let me talk to your mother. We'll figure out the details. I don't know, I said. I honestly don't know. All right, Patricia said. Here's what I know. Regardless of your parents' involvement, the document is dated after your purchase was completed and recorded. It has no legal validity with respect to your property. You own that house. No one can sell it, list it, encumber it, or transfer it without your signature. She folded her hands on the desk. What I recommend is this: a certified letter to your brother, copied to your parents, outlining the fraudulent nature of the document and the potential criminal liability for the person who created it. Simultaneously, I will contact the notary to determine how that stamp was obtained. And I would strongly suggest you consider whether you want to pursue this as a criminal matter. Is that what this is? I said. Criminal. Submitting a forged document in furtherance of a fraudulent real estate transaction, Patricia said. Yes, Clara, that's what this is. I drove home from her office in the dark. I remember that the radio was on, some evening call-in program, voices talking about something ordinary and distant, and I turned it off after 30 seconds because the ordinariness of it felt unbearable. The road to Millhaven was 40 minutes of 2-lane highway through farmland, and I drove it without seeing it. And when I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, I sat in the car for a long time with my hands in my lap, looking at the dark shape of my house against the dark sky. The rose hedge was invisible in the dark, but I could smell it through the car window, which I had cracked open without thinking. That thick, sweet, faintly spiced smell, my house, my home, and someone in my family had decided it was theirs to take. I went inside. I made tea I didn't drink. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and I wrote 2 things. First, a timeline of every conversation, every phone call, every text message, every meeting, going all the way back to March. Second, a list of every question I still couldn't answer. Who had created the forged document? Who had signed it or had their signature forged? Who had found the notary and what had they been told? Had my parents known? Had my father's careful, exhausted voice been genuine or performance? That last question was the one I kept circling back to, the one I couldn't set down. I needed to talk to my father. I called him the next morning, Saturday. He answered on the second ring, and I could tell from the sound of the background. No television, no radio, quieter than the condo usually was. That my mother was not in the room. "Dad," I said, "I need you to tell me the truth. Did you sign a document authorizing Danny to sell the house?" A very long pause. "Clara," he said, "did you sign it?" Another pause. And then, in a voice so quiet I had to press the phone hard against my ear to hear it, "Your mother asked me to." The kitchen was very still. Outside, a bird was singing. A thrush that had taken up residence in the pine trees at the back of the property. Its song came through the window, clear and complicated, and completely indifferent to what was happening inside. "She asked you to sign a document authorizing the sale of a property you no longer owned," I said. "She said it was to protect Danny's interests. She said you'd gotten a good deal and it wasn't fair, and this was just to give him leverage to negotiate." "Leverage," I said. She used that word. "She said the lawyer told her." He stopped. "What lawyer?" "I don't know his name. She'd spoken to someone. She said it was just a formality." I closed my eyes. I pressed my free hand flat against the kitchen table and felt the cool, familiar grain of the wood under my palm, and I thought, there was a lawyer. My mother had consulted a lawyer at some point before or after the sale, and the lawyer had told her, or she had told the lawyer, something that resulted in a forged document and a fraudulent listing. This had not been an impulsive, grief-stricken mistake. This had been planned. This had been planned carefully by someone who had done her research. "Dad," I said, "I need you to understand something. That document is a forgery. Whether or not you signed it, whatever date is on it, it was created after the sale closed. And submitting it to a real estate agent as part of a fraudulent transaction is a crime. My attorney is already looking into it." The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. It had a different quality. Not the silence of a man choosing his words, but the silence of a man realizing for the first time the full dimensions of what he had walked into. "Your mother didn't tell me that," he said. "I know," I said. "I believe you." The confrontation with my mother and Danny happened 4 days later, in my living room. I had asked them to come. I had not told them why exactly, only that I needed to discuss the listing and that Patricia Voss would be present. Danny arrived first, 5 minutes late, in a jacket that was slightly too formal for the occasion, the jacket of a man who is dressed for a negotiation. He stopped when he saw Patricia sitting in the armchair with her legal pad, and something moved across his face, very quickly, there and then gone. My mother arrived 7 minutes after Danny. She came through the front door and looked around the room, at me, at Patricia, at the folder on the coffee table. And her expression did something I had never seen it do before. For just a moment, before she reassembled it, her face was completely unguarded. And what I saw in that unguarded moment was not guilt. It was calculation. The rapid, practiced calculation of a woman deciding which version of herself to deploy. She chose grief. She sat down on the sofa next to Danny, set her handbag on her knees, and pressed her lips together in a way that suggested she was barely holding herself together. "I want to understand why there is a lawyer present," she said to me. "I came here to talk to my daughter." "You came here," I said, "because your son submitted a forged authorization document to a real estate agency in an attempt to sell my house, and I want to know who created that document." "Clara, I don't—" "The notary has already confirmed," Patricia said, her voice completely flat. that the person who presented the document for notarization was a woman matching your description, acting on behalf of your son on May 11th of this year. The notary states she was told it was a routine estate matter and had no reason to believe the property had already been sold. She has provided a sworn statement to that effect. My mother's face did not change, and that, more than anything, more than the forgery, more than the listing, more than all the careful architecture of what had been done, that stillness told me everything. Because a woman who had made a mistake would have flinched. A woman who had done something wrong without fully understanding it would have gone pale, would have started to cry, would have said, "I didn't know, I didn't realize." My mother's face stayed perfectly arranged. "We were protecting the family's interests," she said. "Whose family?" I said. "Because you took my savings. You took the house I bought with every cent I had saved in 8 years. You watched me sign that deed, and you held my face in your hands, and you looked at me, and you had already planned this. You were always going to be fine," she said. "You're always fine, Clara. You're the responsible one. Danny needed this more than you did." I looked at her. I looked at her for a long time, and I felt something happen in my chest. Not the collapse I might have expected, not grief, but something that went very quiet and very hard, like water turning to ice. "He needed it more," I said, "and so you decided to take it." Danny shifted on the sofa. "It wasn't like that," he said, but his voice had lost its rehearsed quality entirely. He sounded, for the first time, like someone genuinely uncertain. "Mom said there were legal options. She said there was a case to be made that the sale was below fair market value and that—" "There is no case," Patricia said. "The sale was completed at agreed-upon terms between willing parties. The title transferred cleanly. What occurred afterward constitutes fraud. The real estate agency has filed a complaint with the state licensing board. The notary has filed a separate report. I have prepared civil and criminal referral documents, and I am prepared to file them today, unless your clients wish to discuss an alternative resolution." The room went quiet. Outside, I could hear the wind moving through the pine trees. That specific sound like breathing, slow and deep and patient. It was Danny who broke first. His jaw moved. His hands, I noticed, were clasped very tightly on his knees. "What kind of alternative resolution?" he said, and the careful, wronged man posture had gone out of him entirely. He sounded like my younger brother again, the way he had at 8 years old, caught in something he hadn't fully thought through. My mother said nothing. She was looking at the floor, and I thought she knew this was possible. She had known from the beginning that this outcome existed, and she had tried it anyway because she had calculated that I would not fight back. She had looked at me for 31 years, the careful one, the responsible one, the one who kept the peace, and she had decided that I did not have it in me. She was wrong. Patricia walked them through what the alternative resolution looked like. A formal written acknowledgement signed by both Danny and my mother of what had occurred and the fraudulent nature of the document. A notarized retraction filed with the real estate agency, a payment to cover my attorney's fees, and a legally binding agreement that neither of them would make any future claim, legal or otherwise, against my ownership of the property. In exchange, I would not pursue criminal charges. "And if we don't agree," Danny said, "then I file today," Patricia said, "and a prosecutor decides what happens next." They signed the agreement 3 days later. Danny came alone to Patricia's office without my mother, who had developed what was described to me as a migraine and could not attend. He sat across from me at the conference table and signed each page without looking at me. And when it was over, he stood up and finally met my eyes, and I saw something in them that I hadn't expected. Not defiance, not resentment, but something closer to shame. Real shame. The deep, unglamorous kind that doesn't go away when the room clears. "I didn't think it would go this far," he said. "I know," I said, "but it did." He left. I stayed in the conference room for a few minutes after Patricia had gone to make copies, sitting in the quiet with my hands on the table. Through the window, I could see a parking lot, a strip of sky, the edge of a cloud moving slowly south. I thought about my mother, at home with her migraine, in the condo near the coast. I thought about my father, who had called me the night before to say he was sorry, in a voice that sounded like a man who had been sorry about something for a very long time and was only now able to say it aloud. I thought about all the years I had spent being careful, saving, planning, building something solid, and about the particular cruelty of having the people who were supposed to want that for you be the ones who tried hardest to take it away. I also thought about the rose hedge. It would need cutting back before the end of summer. I found myself thinking about that. The specific, ordinary work of it. The smell of the roses and the scratch of the thorns. The particular satisfaction of restoring something overgrown to something tended. That was mine. All of it was mine. It has been 8 months since Danny signed that agreement. I still live in the house in Millhaven. The kitchen has been updated. New counters, a proper backsplash, the small renovations I had been planning since before the closing and kept putting off while everything fell apart around me. The roof is scheduled for next spring. My father visited twice in the fall. He sat on the front porch in the same spot he had sat in for 35 years, and we talked and did not talk, and both of those things were a kind of honesty. My mother has not visited. We speak occasionally, short calls, careful and surface level. I don't know what the future of that looks like. I have stopped trying to arrange it in advance. What I know is this. I sit on my front porch in the mornings with a cup of coffee in the particular stillness of a weekday before the town wakes up. The rose hedge is trimmed now, orderly and dark green against the south wall. In the early light, it looks exactly as it always did. Old, permanent, rooted in something that does not ask permission to grow. I bought this house with the last of everything I had, and I kept it the same way, by understanding, finally, that some things are worth fighting for, even when, especially when, the fight costs you something you thought you couldn't afford to lose. The keys are on the hook by the front door. They have been there every morning for 8 months, cold brass, slightly heavy. I touch them each time I leave, out of habit now, out of something closer to gratitude. They are mine. I earned them twice.